In the late 19th century, Europe was in the midst of what many historians call the scramble for Africa. The great powers of the continent were racing to carve up vast territories, each seeking resources, prestige, and influence. Among these nations stood Belgium, a small country compared to the giants of Britain, France, and Germany. And at its helm was King Leopold II, a man with ambitions far larger than the borders of his own kingdom. Leopold was not satisfied with ruling a small European nation. He dreamed of empire, of personal glory, and of wealth beyond imagination. He watched as his neighboring monarchs expanded overseas, their flags flying high over distant lands. And in his mind, he wondered, why not Belgium? Why not me? Yet Leopold's vision was not simply about national pride. Unlike other European rulers who sought colonies for their states, Leopold sought one for himself. He was clever, shrewd, and determined. He understood that if he could seize a territory rich in natural resources, he could turn it into his own private fortune. He wanted land that would not belong to Belgium, but to Leopold personally. And in Africa, he found what he was looking for. Cloaked in the language of progress and philanthropy, he began presenting himself as a humanitarian. He spoke of science, of exploration, of bringing so-called civilization to people who lived far from Europe. To the world, he wore the mask of a benevolent ruler eager to advance knowledge and improve lives. But behind the curtain, his thoughts were fixed on power and profit. This is where our story begins, not with grand ideals or noble missions, but with a king who saw an entire land as an opportunity for personal gain. His eyes fell on the Congo, a region of unimaginable size and natural wealth. Dense forests, flowing rivers, and a land teeming with ivory, rubber, and minerals. It was a place whose beauty and abundance could inspire awe, but to Leopold, it represented something else: control, money, and empire. When we think of history, it is often easy to picture maps, treaties, and battles. But the story we are about to unfold is not only about politics, it is about people. It is about what happens when one man's hunger for power collides with the lives of millions. And it is about how the pursuit of wealth can transform a dream into a nightmare. As we uncover the untold story of King Leopold's rise to power in Africa, I invite you to stay with me until the end of this journey. The past may feel distant, but its echoes reach us even today. By learning what happened, we not only honor the voices that were silenced but also remind ourselves of the importance of justice, truth, and memory. If you are ready to explore this hidden chapter of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. Together, let us step back into time and discover the truth that was long left in the shadows. In the year 1885, something extraordinary and deeply unsettling took place. At a time when the map of Africa was being redrawn by powerful European empires, a single man managed to secure an entire territory, nearly 1 million square miles, for himself. Not for his country, not for his people, but for his own personal ownership. That man was King Leopold II of Belgium, and the land he claimed was the Congo Basin. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was meant to organize the chaotic scramble for Africa. Nations gathered around long polished tables, diplomats leaning over maps, deciding who would control which regions of the continent. Britain eyed the Nile, France set its sights on West Africa, Germany moved into the south. But in this contest of nations, Leopold played a different game. He did not enter the conference as merely the king of a small European country. He arrived with the cunning of a businessman, cloaking his ambition beneath the veil of philanthropy. Leopold convinced the world that his mission in Central Africa was not conquest but compassion. He spoke of humanitarian ideals, of fighting the trade in captives, of promoting science and exploration, of bringing education and spiritual guidance to the so-called untouched corners of the continent. He framed himself as a champion of progress, a ruler motivated by higher values. His words painted him as a noble figure, unlike the typical conquerors who sought only land and wealth. And remarkably, the other powers believed him, or at least pretended to, because his narrative was convenient. When the discussions ended, Leopold emerged victorious in a way that stunned the world. He had secured international recognition over the vast Congo basin. But here lies the twist: it was not granted to Belgium, the nation he ruled. It was granted to Leopold personally. The land did not belong to his government, it belonged to him, as though one man had reached out his hand and claimed a kingdom the size of Western Europe. To give his enterprise a respectable name, he called it the Congo Free State. On paper, the title sounded generous, even idealistic. It implied liberty, progress, and opportunity. To casual observers in Europe, the word suggested a place where new beginnings could take root under the guidance of a benevolent monarch. But behind the polished title lay a darker truth. The people living in the Congo were not asked, not consulted, and not considered free in any sense of the word. The Congo Free State was unlike any other colony of its time. It was not overseen by a parliament, nor was it accountable to a government. There was no national debate over policy, no elected officials to check the king's authority. Instead, it was Leopold's personal domain, his private estate, his business empire disguised as a humanitarian project. He had created a state where every law, every regulation, every decision flowed directly from his will. Imagine the scale of it: forests stretching endlessly, rivers winding like silver veins through the land, villages filled with generations who had lived there long before Europeans arrived. All of it now signed away by agreements few locals could understand, agreements written in languages they did not speak, and endorsed in faraway cities they would never see. Overnight, millions of people were declared subjects of a ruler who had never set foot among them. Leopold's genius, if we can call it that, was in the way he manipulated perception. In Europe, newspapers praised him for his philanthropic spirit. He was celebrated as a forward-thinking monarch bringing civilization to a distant corner of the globe. The international community applauded the creation of the Congo Free State, many seeing it as a progressive experiment that avoided the pitfalls of traditional colonialism. They saw the surface, not the reality. The reality was that this arrangement gave Leopold unprecedented power. Unlike colonial administrators who answered to parliaments or ministries, he answered only to himself. He could make treaties, impose taxes, extract resources, and enforce his will without oversight. He could treat the land as a company and its inhabitants as laborers. The Congo Free State was essentially a corporation with Leopold as its sole shareholder. From the very start, his eyes were on the wealth buried within the forests and rivers of Congo. Ivory, prized for its beauty and value, flowed out of the region. Later, the booming demand for rubber, fueled by bicycles, automobiles, and industry, made the land even more lucrative. For Leopold, the Congo Free State was not a noble experiment, it was a gold mine waiting to be tapped. But the most important thing to understand is this: in 1885, Leopold achieved something no other European monarch had done. He blurred the line between king and entrepreneur, between ruler and profiteer. He had convinced the world to recognize his private ownership of a land that was home to millions of people. And by doing so, he laid the groundwork for one of history's most infamous chapters. The name, Congo Free State, remains one of the most ironic titles in history. To the outside world, it sounded like a land of promise. To those who lived there, it marked the beginning of years of hardship. The promises of liberty and progress turned quickly into demands for labor, quotas, and control. But in 1885, when Leopold first held his prize, none of that was yet visible to the world. At that moment, he stood triumphant, a king who had secured not just a colony, but an empire for himself alone. This was not the story of Belgium's expansion, it was the story of Leopold's ambition. And it would soon reshape the lives of millions in ways few could have imagined. The Congo Free State began as a dream in the mind of a monarch, but it would soon become a reality that haunted generations. The title was written in ink, but its true meaning would be etched in blood, sweat, and struggle. The year 1885 was the beginning. And from that beginning, an entire continent would feel the weight of one man's hunger for power. Deep in the heart of Central Africa, where vast forests stretched farther than the eye could see and rivers wound like silver through the land, life changed almost overnight. For centuries, communities had thrived in the Congo basin, living according to their own rhythms, traditions, and connections to the land. But with the arrival of foreign rule under King Leopold's Congo Free State, the familiar order of life was disrupted in ways no one could have imagined. The forests that had once been sources of food, shelter, and spiritual meaning were suddenly transformed into targets of relentless demand. Rubber, ivory, and minerals, resources once valued locally for their usefulness, became commodities to feed the hunger of distant markets in Europe and beyond. The rise of rubber in particular reshaped the Congo's fate. In the late 19th century, bicycles and automobiles were booming across Europe and America, creating an insatiable appetite for rubber to make tires, hoses, and industrial goods. Leopold recognized this opportunity, and he turned his so-called humanitarian project into a system designed to wring every drop of value from the forests of Congo. What this meant for the people who lived there was devastating. They were no longer simply farmers, hunters, or traders. They were transformed into forced laborers for a system that demanded rubber at any cost. Men were compelled to leave their villages, venturing deep into the forests to tap vines and gather latex. This was not simple or easy work. Rubber vines twisted through the jungle, high up in trees or tangled among thick undergrowth. The process required long hours of scraping, climbing, and collecting sticky sap that clung stubbornly to skin. Entire days were consumed by the task, often leaving workers with little time or energy to tend their own crops or care for their families. Quotas were imposed by officials, and failure to meet them was not tolerated. Ivory was another demand that weighed heavily on the people. Elephants, once roaming the forests freely, became targets in a deadly hunt. Men were ordered to track them, sometimes for weeks, risking their lives to bring down creatures that could weigh several tons. Tusks were pried away, destined to be carved into piano keys, jewelry, and ornaments in European parlors. For the hunters, it was not adventure, it was survival under pressure. And then there were the minerals. The rivers and soil of Congo were rich with treasures that fueled global industries, copper, gold, and other resources that sparkled with promise for foreign investors. Extracting them required immense physical effort, often with little more than rudimentary tools. The people who once dug the earth for small-scale farming were now digging to satisfy the demands of an empire built on wealth and illusion. This system touched every corner of life. Villages were disrupted as men were taken to the forests or mines, leaving behind women, children, and elders to fend for themselves. Families were fractured, communities strained, and traditional ways of life eroded under the constant pressure of quotas and labor. What had once been a land of abundance now became a place of scarcity, not because the earth had stopped giving, but because its gifts were being extracted for someone else's gain. To enforce this new order, Leopold's administrators created a chain of authority that reached into even the smallest villages. Local leaders were pressured to supply workers, and officers monitored output with ruthless efficiency. The system was not merely economic, it was a structure of control, designed to ensure that no village could escape the demand for labor. Where once freedom had been defined by the forest and the river, now it was defined by the weight of obligations that could not be refused. The suffering that resulted was immense, though often hidden from the eyes of those in Europe who still believed in Leopold's story of philanthropy. Reports that reached the outside world spoke of prosperity and progress, of a land being civilized. But the reality on the ground was far different. The Congolese people bore the heaviest burden, their lives reshaped into a cycle of toil and fear. In every village, stories were told of men vanishing into the forests for weeks, of children growing up without fathers, of mothers struggling to feed families when traditional farming was abandoned. The sound of axes cutting through trees, the crack of rifles in elephant hunts, the endless trek of carrying goods along jungle paths, these became the rhythms of life under the Congo Free State. The land was rich, but the people were made poor by the system that claimed their labor and gave little in return. What makes this chapter in history so striking is not only the scale of the exploitation but also the way it was hidden beneath fine words. While newspapers in Europe printed praise for Leopold's vision, villages in the Congo echoed with the cries of exhaustion. While ivory gleamed in drawing rooms and rubber-fueled industry, the people who had harvested them were left broken, their lives consumed by endless demands. It is easy to speak of millions of lives affected, but behind that number were individuals, men who once hunted freely, women who once tended their fields, children who once played along riverbanks. Each was drawn into a system that stripped away not only their labor but their dignity and their way of life. This was the paradox of the Congo Free State, a land called free, where freedom was taken, a project advertised as humanitarian but built on relentless extraction. The riches of the Congo flowed outward, carried on ships to distant markets, while the people who lived closest to those riches suffered most. The forests, rivers, and soil became symbols of profit abroad, but in Congo, they became chains binding entire communities to labor they had not chosen. The story of this time is not only about economics, it is about human resilience under extraordinary strain. Despite the hardship, families endured, cultures survived, and voices began to rise, telling the truth of what was happening. Those voices, carried eventually to the wider world, would challenge the disguise Leopold had so carefully constructed. But before that awakening, the people of Congo endured years where their lives were measured not by their own dreams or traditions, but by how much rubber, ivory, or mineral they could produce. It was a chapter marked by contradiction, a king who spoke of philanthropy but pursued profit, a land called free but held captive by quotas, and a people who faced unimaginable trials yet carried within them the strength to endure. This was the hidden reality behind the grand speeches and noble promises, the untold story of millions whose daily labor sustained an empire built on illusion. In the Congo Free State, life was measured not by the passing of seasons or the rhythm of harvests, but by the relentless weight of quotas. Villages that had once thrived on farming, hunting, and trading now lived under the shadow of demands that could never truly be satisfied. Each family, each community, was assigned a target, a certain amount of rubber, ivory, or other goods that had to be delivered. These quotas were not suggestions, they were commands enforced with severity. At first, people believed they could somehow adapt. Men ventured deeper into the forests, searching for rubber vines that oozed the precious sap. They hunted elephants with greater intensity, dug into the earth for minerals, and pushed themselves far beyond their limits. But the quotas were not set with fairness in mind. They were designed to maximize profit, to squeeze as much as possible from every person, every village, every corner of the land. No matter how much was gathered, it was never enough. The system was unforgiving. If a man failed to bring back the required amount, the consequences did not fall on him alone. The entire community could suffer. To ensure compliance, officials resorted to tactics that spread fear through every household. Families were torn apart as hostages were taken, wives, children, and elders held as guarantees that the men would return with their quotas met. Imagine the weight of such a choice, a father in the forest, struggling to scrape rubber from vines, knowing that if he failed, his loved ones would pay the price. For many, the impossibility of the demands meant punishment became inevitable. And punishment in the Congo Free State was designed not only to inflict pain but also to send a message. Villages lived with the constant threat of public beatings, imprisonment, or worse. Stories circulated of men being singled out, their bodies marked forever as warnings to others. The most chilling of these punishments became infamous across the land, the loss of hands. It is difficult to imagine such cruelty, but within the system it was carried out with cold calculation. Armed sentries, often local men conscripted into service, were required to account for every bullet they fired. To prove that ammunition had not been wasted in hunting or rebellion, they were ordered to return with evidence. This grotesque policy meant that the people themselves bore the proof, hands severed from victims, a brutal accounting system that turned human lives into statistics. Villagers knew these horrors not as distant rumors but as immediate realities. Children grew up with fear etched into their earliest memories. Mothers lived with constant anxiety, never sure if their families would be safe from night raids or sudden reprisals. Entire communities were uprooted, their fields left untended as survival became centered on meeting impossible demands. Life, once filled with music, stories, and traditions, was overshadowed by silence and dread. The atmosphere of fear was so widespread that it touched even the smallest details of daily life. A knock at the door, the sight of an armed patrol approaching, or the echo of a distant gunshot could send waves of panic through a village. Every person, young and old, understood that their safety depended not on their own actions alone but on whether their community delivered enough to satisfy distant rulers who never set foot in their homes. These acts of violence were not random, nor were they the result of a few cruel individuals. They were part of a system, a deliberate structure designed to enforce quotas through terror. By instilling fear, Leopold's administrators ensured that no one dared resist openly. The consequences of failure became so severe that entire populations bent under the pressure, caught in a cycle of labor, punishment, and fear that seemed endless. Yet even in this atmosphere of brutality, resilience flickered. Families whispered to one another, reminding themselves of who they were before the quotas. Elders passed down stories in hushed tones, trying to preserve traditions that the system sought to erase. Acts of quiet resistance took many forms, slowing down work when possible, hiding loved ones, or finding ways to shield children from being taken as hostages. These small acts, though dangerous, showed that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit refused to be completely broken. Still, the scars of this period were deep. Villages were left half-empty, crops untended, and entire generations grew up under the shadow of violence. The trauma did not end when the day's labor was over. It lingered, carried in memories, in the silence of families who had lost loved ones, in the fear etched into children's eyes. What makes this chapter especially haunting is how it was hidden from much of the world. In Europe, the Congo was spoken of as a model project, a beacon of progress and civilization. Newspapers printed stories of development, science, and trade, while the reality was one of suffering and fear. The brutality of quotas and punishments remained largely invisible, concealed behind carefully crafted reports and speeches. Only later, when witnesses began to speak out and photographs emerged, did the wider world begin to glimpse the truth. By then, countless lives had already been torn apart. The land itself seemed to carry the weight of grief, forests where men labored under threat, rivers that bore the silence of those lost, villages that remembered what it meant to live in constant fear of the quotas. The story of the Congo Free State is often told in numbers: millions of lives disrupted, villages destroyed, resources extracted. But numbers alone cannot capture the depth of the suffering. Behind every statistic was a face, a name, a family struggling to survive. The violence of quotas and punishments did not just take lives, it sought to break the very fabric of communities. And yet, history remembers not only the cruelty but also the endurance of the people who lived through it. Their strength, their survival, and their eventual fight to tell their story stand as a testament to human resilience. The darkness of that era cannot be ignored, but neither can the courage of those who carried their traditions, their families, and their hopes through a time of unimaginable hardship. This chapter reminds us of the cost of unchecked ambition, of what happens when human lives are measured only in quotas and profit. It is a story of pain, yes, but also a reminder of the voices that refuse to remain silent, voices that continue to echo across time, urging us never to forget. When we look back at history, numbers are often the first thing we see. They are simple, stark, and seemingly clear. But behind every number lies a story far more complex, filled with human lives, voices, and memories. In the case of the Congo Free State, the numbers are overwhelming. At the beginning of Leopold's reign over the region, the population stood at roughly 20 million. By the time his control came to an end, that number had been cut in half. 10 million people, gone within a single generation. It is difficult to comprehend what such a loss means. Numbers can be written on paper, tallied in reports, or repeated in history books, but they do not capture the silence left behind. Imagine an entire country losing half of its people within a few decades. Every village, every community, every family felt the impact. It was not an abstract reduction, it was the absence of neighbors, the emptiness of homes, the fields left untended because there were no hands left to work them. The decline was not the result of a single event but a long chain of hardships that compounded upon one another. Forced labor tore men and women away from their traditional lives, leaving them exhausted and broken. Families were split apart as hostages were taken to guarantee rubber quotas, or as men were marched deep into forests to extract resources. Disease, already a challenge in any densely forested region, spread unchecked among populations weakened by hunger and overwork. Entire communities were uprooted, leaving them vulnerable to famine when crops failed or when they could no longer plant their fields. Violence added another layer to this tragedy. The enforcement of quotas was carried out through fear, and fear often translated into bloodshed. Villages that resisted were punished severely, sometimes burned to the ground, their people dispersed or killed. The policy of collective responsibility meant that one individual's failure could bring disaster upon an entire community. Slowly but surely, the numbers began to dwindle, each life lost leaving a hole that could not be filled. What is most haunting is the way this loss unfolded in silence. For much of the world, the Congo remained a faraway place, described in official reports as a land of progress and enterprise. To European audiences, newspapers often spoke of new roads, schools, or trade routes. Rarely did they mention the suffering of the people who lived there. And so, while millions were vanishing, the wider world went on unaware, content to believe in the story of civilization being brought to Africa. But the Congolese knew the truth in their bones. They carried it in their daily struggles, in the faces of children who grew up without parents, in the communities where entire generations were missing. Oral traditions kept the memory alive, even when written accounts ignored it. In the silence of the forests and along the banks of rivers, stories were whispered, stories of what had been lost and of the lives that once filled the land. The impact of such a demographic collapse was not limited to numbers. Culture itself suffered. Traditions that depended on elders to pass them down were interrupted. Songs, stories, and rituals were sometimes lost with those who had carried them. Villages that once celebrated festivals or marked seasonal cycles found themselves too broken, too fearful, or too scattered to continue. The spiritual heart of the Congo, as much as its physical population, was under attack. And yet, despite the enormity of this loss, people endured. Survivors carried their memories forward. They preserved what they could, even if in fragments, and passed them on to future generations. The very fact that we can still hear Congolese voices telling of that era is proof that the population did not disappear into silence completely. Out of devastation came resilience, the determination to endure even when the odds seemed impossible. When historians describe the Congo's population dropping from 20 million to 10 million, it is often presented as a statistic, cold, detached, almost clinical. But it was not a statistic to those who lived through it. It was the missing laughter of children in villages where they once ran free. It was the grief of parents who never saw their sons return from the forests. It was the mourning of wives who never embraced their husbands again. It was the quiet emptiness of paths once busy with life, now abandoned and overgrown. To understand this chapter of history is to understand that numbers alone do not tell the whole story. 10 million lives lost is not just a figure, it is 10 million individual human beings with hopes, families, and futures. It is 10 million voices silenced. 10 million stories that will never be told. And it is the grief of those left behind, carrying the weight of absence for the rest of their lives. This decline also reminds us of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the human cost of exploitation. Leopold's vision of wealth and power was realized in material terms, but it came at the expense of an entire nation's well-being. The Congo's people were not merely resources to be managed, they were human beings whose lives mattered. Yet for decades, their suffering remained hidden, reduced to silence and denial. Today, remembering this history is not only about acknowledging loss but also about honoring resilience. It is about recognizing that, even when half a nation was wiped away, the other half carried on. They endured the hardship, preserved what they could, and laid the foundations for the generations that followed. The scars remain, but so does the strength of those who survived. The story of the Congo's population decline under Leopold's reign is a reminder that behind every statistic lies human reality. 10 million lives were extinguished, but 10 million more endured. And it is through their endurance that the memory of what happened still reaches us today. To speak of this loss is not only to recount tragedy but also to honor those who refuse to let the memory fade into silence. When King Leopold II set his eyes on the Congo, he understood one thing very clearly: his rule could not survive without control. To extract the wealth of a land as vast and as rich as the Congo Basin, he needed more than treaties, contracts, or diplomatic speeches. He needed an instrument of power that could bend millions of people to his will. Out of this ambition came the creation of one of the most feared colonial armies in African history, the Force Publique. On paper, it looked like a regular military organization. It was officially tasked with maintaining order, guarding frontiers, and protecting trade. To the outside world, it appeared as a symbol of modern governance in a land being open to the global stage. But in reality, the Force Publique became the very embodiment of terror. It was not simply an army, it was an engine of fear, designed to enforce quotas and obedience through brutality. The Force Publique was composed of local recruits, often taken from rival ethnic groups, trained and commanded by European officers. Men who might have resisted foreign rule were turned into instruments of it, forced to enforce laws and quotas upon their fellow Congolese. With rifles in their hands and punishment as their command, they spread throughout the villages and forests of the Congo, carrying with them a reign of intimidation. Violence became the language of control. Rubber quotas were enforced not with persuasion, but with the crack of the whip, the torch set to a home, or the rifle fired into a crowd. Entire communities lived under the shadow of collective punishment. If one man failed to meet his quota, his village could pay the price. Fear seeped into every corner of daily life, for the Force Publique could appear at any time, demanding what seemed impossible to give. The psychological impact was immense. Villagers knew that their lives were no longer their own, that their labor and even their bodies could be taken at any moment. Families were torn apart when husbands, fathers, or sons were marched away at gunpoint. Mothers feared for their children, who could be seized as leverage or forced into servitude. In this way, terror was not only physical but deeply emotional, eating away at the very fabric of family and community bonds. But the reach of the Force Publique extended beyond violence alone. Its presence also brought disease and despair. With so many people uprooted from their villages and forced into long marches to harvest rubber or carry loads, traditional farming and food production collapsed. Malnutrition weakened entire populations, making them more vulnerable to illness. The spread of new diseases, carried along rivers and trade routes, found easy victims among communities already struggling to survive. Everywhere they went, the Force Publique left behind silence and fear. Villages emptied as people fled into the forests to escape the soldiers' patrols. Those who remained lived in constant anxiety, never knowing when demands would come or what the consequences of refusal might be. Fields that once grew abundant crops were left untended, and rivers that once carried fishermen's laughter grew quiet. The rhythm of life that had sustained communities for centuries was disrupted, replaced by a rhythm of fear dictated by soldiers' boots and officers' orders. The structure of the Force Publique itself ensured that cruelty spread unchecked. European officers demanded results, and the soldiers beneath them knew that failure to deliver could bring punishment upon themselves. To prove their success, they carried evidence of the violence they inflicted. In this system, violence became not just a tool but a requirement. Fear was not an accident of the Force Publique, it was its very purpose. Imagine living in such an environment, where every sound in the distance might signal the arrival of soldiers, where every family gathering could be interrupted by the demand for labor or goods. Communities learned to live cautiously, to hide what little they had, and to move constantly in search of safety. But there was no true safety to be found, because the Force Publique's reach was vast, stretching across rivers, forests, and villages alike. The terror they spread also shaped the way history remembers this period. Travelers and missionaries who witnessed their actions carried stories back to Europe, describing villages destroyed, families scattered, and people left broken in body and spirit. Their testimonies eventually fueled outrage across the world, but for those who lived under the force public's rule, outrage from afar did little to ease the daily suffering. The very existence of this army reminds us how fear can be institutionalized, how an organized force can transform entire regions not through inspiration or leadership, but through intimidation. The Congo was not governed through consent, it was governed through fear. The force public was the hand that made Leopold's will a reality, ensuring that resources flowed from the Congo to Europe, no matter the cost to the people. Yet, even in the face of this terror, the human spirit endured. People resisted in ways large and small. Some fled into the forests, forming hidden communities far from the soldiers' patrols. Others fought back when the opportunity arose, sometimes at great cost. Stories of resistance survived alongside stories of fear, reminding us that the Congolese were never simply passive victims. They endured, resisted, and preserved their dignity wherever they could. The legacy of the force public is one of shadows and silence, but also of memory. To this day, the very mention of it conjures images of an era when fear was used as a weapon of control, when soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms patrolled the paths of villages, and when the price of disobedience was written into the lives of millions. It is a reminder of how fragile communities can be when confronted with organized violence, but also of how memory carries forward the truth long after the guns have fallen silent. To tell the story of the force public is to tell the story of how terror can become law, how fear can become governance, and how an entire people can be forced to live under the weight of both. But it is also to remind ourselves of resilience, that even in the darkest times, voices survived, stories endured, and the spirit of resistance continued to burn quietly beneath the surface. For in the end, no army, however fearsome, can completely erase the will of a people to endure. At first, the world knew very little about what was happening deep in the Congo basin. The land was vast, isolated, and shrouded in mystery. Reports that reached Europe were carefully controlled, often wrapped in the polished language of progress, philanthropy, and civilization. King Leopold II wanted the outside world to see his Congo Free State as a beacon of modernity, a noble project that brought trade, education, and faith to a distant corner of Africa. For a time, many accepted this illusion. But the truth could not remain hidden forever. The first cracks in the facade appeared through the words and testimonies of missionaries. They were among the few outsiders who lived close to the Congolese people, witnessing daily life in villages and along riverbanks. Unlike government officials or company agents, missionaries had no stake in Leopold's profits. Their duty was to faith, service, and the communities they sought to reach. What they saw troubled them deeply: families broken apart, men and women forced into endless labor, and children left without care because their parents had been taken to the forests. They wrote letters to their churches and congregations, describing scenes of despair that clashed violently with the glowing reports presented in European capitals. These letters, sometimes smuggled out at great personal risk, became seeds of doubt. In Britain, America, and beyond, church communities began asking questions. How could this so-called humanitarian project bring so much suffering? How could a land that was supposed to be free instead be filled with fear? Missionaries' testimonies gave voice to the Congolese experience, revealing what official reports tried so carefully to conceal. Journalists soon followed. A handful of brave correspondents traveled into the Congo or interviewed those who had witnessed the situation firsthand. They were relentless in their pursuit of truth, unwilling to let polite diplomacy silence the stories they uncovered. Among them was the Irish journalist E.D. Morel, who noticed something strange in shipping records. From Congo to Europe came ship after ship laden with rubber and ivory, products of immense value. But in return, the vessels carried not trade goods, not food, not clothing, but weapons and ammunition. Morel realized the truth: this was not commerce between equals, this was exploitation enforced by violence. His discovery fueled a campaign unlike anything seen before. Through newspapers, pamphlets, and public lectures, Morel exposed the grim reality behind Leopold's empire. He wrote not as a distant observer, but as a voice crying out against injustice. His words reached ordinary citizens, who began to see the Congo not as a distant land of adventure but as a place of suffering sustained by greed. Activists soon joined the cause, turning outrage into organized resistance. Humanitarian groups formed, bringing together church leaders, writers, politicians, and concerned citizens. Meetings were held in crowded halls, speeches delivered with fiery passion, and petitions circulated across nations. One of the most powerful voices was that of Roger Casement, a British consul who traveled to the Congo and wrote a report that shocked the world. His detailed accounts of forced labor, punishment, and suffering left little room for denial. Unlike rumors or distant whispers, his report carried the weight of official authority, and it could not be easily dismissed. Together, these missionaries, journalists, and activists built a movement that crossed borders. They harnessed the growing power of newspapers and the energy of public debate to shine light on what was happening in Leopold's private empire. In an age before television or radio, their words became weapons, carried from one city to another, sparking conversations in drawing rooms, churches, and parliaments. International outrage grew louder with each passing year. Citizens who once viewed colonial expansion as a distant affair now demanded answers from their governments. How could such cruelty exist under the banner of civilization? How could a single monarch be allowed to treat an entire land as his personal possession? For many, the Congo became a test of conscience, a question of whether morality could triumph over profit and power. The impact of this outcry was profound. Leopold, once admired as a visionary king, found his reputation collapsing. Newspapers that once praised his efforts now printed cartoons mocking his greed. Parliaments debated his actions, pressured by citizens who refused to look away. The voices of missionaries, journalists, and activists had broken through the wall of silence, forcing the world to confront the reality of the Congo Free State. Yet what makes their work remarkable is not only what they exposed but how they did it. They used the tools available to them, letters, reports, articles, and public meetings, to give voice to people who had been silenced. They reminded the world that progress built on suffering is no progress at all, that no claim of philanthropy can excuse exploitation. Their words carried not only facts but also compassion, painting vivid pictures of lives disrupted and communities broken. In time, their efforts would lead to investigations, reforms, and eventually the removal of the Congo from Leopold's personal control. But even before those changes took place, they had achieved something vital. They had transformed ignorance into awareness, and silence into a chorus of outrage. The story of how missionaries, journalists, and activists exposed the truth of the Congo is a reminder of the power of words, courage, and persistence. It shows that even in an age when powerful men controlled governments and empires, determined voices could still cut through the noise, rally public opinion, and demand accountability. Their legacy endures as a testament to the importance of speaking out against injustice, no matter how distant or difficult it may seem. Without them, the suffering of millions might have remained hidden, buried beneath propaganda and silence. With them, the world was forced to look, to listen, and to remember. And in their courage, we see proof that truth, once spoken, has the power to change history. In the final years of the 19th century, the Congo Free State was a place that outsiders rarely saw in its raw reality. To most of Europe, it appeared only in glowing reports, described as a land where progress and commerce flourished under the guidance of a visionary king. But beneath this carefully constructed illusion was a system sustained by fear and violence. What the world did not see was the suffering of millions, hidden behind official documents and propaganda. It would take a few determined individuals, armed not with weapons but with truth, to lift the veil. Among them, two names would echo through history, Edmond de Morel and Roger Casement. Edmond Morel was not a politician or a soldier. He was a shipping clerk in Liverpool, a man whose work involved nothing more glamorous than reviewing cargo lists and handling paperwork for a trading company. Yet it was precisely this ordinary task that led him to one of the greatest revelations of his time. Day after day, Morel examined the records of ships traveling between Belgium and the Congo. What he saw troubled him deeply. The ships arriving in Europe were loaded with ivory and rubber, commodities worth fortunes. But when he checked what was being sent back, the cargoes were not filled with trade goods or supplies for a growing economy. Instead, they were stacked with firearms, ammunition, and chains. The conclusion was unavoidable: this was not trade. This was extraction at gunpoint. The Congo was not participating in an exchange, it was being drained, its people forced to labor without choice or reward. For Morel, the figures on the page became the outlines of a crime, and he could not ignore them. Though he was just one man, he made a decision that would change history: he would dedicate his life to exposing the truth. Morel turned to the pen as his weapon. He wrote articles, gave lectures, and eventually founded the Congo Reform Association, a movement dedicated to bringing international attention to the abuses taking place. His words were not filled with the dry language of statistics but with urgency and outrage. He described the suffering of people who had been reduced to tools for profit, their lives controlled by quotas and overseers. For many readers, Morel's work was the first time they encountered a version of the Congo that was not wrapped in the polished speeches of King Leopold's agents. While Morel pieced together the truth from shipping records and testimony, Roger Casement, a British consul, brought a different kind of evidence: the power of observation. Sent to the Congo to investigate rumors of abuse, Casement traveled through villages, speaking directly to those who had lived under the shadow of forced labor. What he heard and saw left a permanent mark on him. Families torn apart, communities stripped of their able-bodied men, children left hungry because their parents were forced into the forests for endless work. He collected testimonies with care, ensuring that the voices of the Congolese themselves were preserved and carried across the seas. Casement's report, published in 1904, became one of the most damning documents of the age. Written with precision and compassion, it detailed the suffering that official narratives had denied. He spoke not of vague impressions but of specific practices, labor demands that could never be met, punishments inflicted for failure, and the daily terror that ruled the Congo Free State. His words carried the authority of a government official, and they left little room for doubt. Where Morel provided the evidence of economics, Casement provided the human testimony. Together, they painted a picture that no one could ignore. The partnership between Morel and Casement was remarkable. One was a civilian with no official standing, driven by conscience. The other was a diplomat, bound by duty yet unwilling to stay silent. They came from different worlds, but they shared a conviction that truth must be revealed. Their combined efforts created a movement that spread far beyond the borders of Belgium or Britain. Citizens across Europe and America read their words, heard their speeches, and began to demand answers from their governments. It is important to understand the courage this required. Speaking against a king was no small matter, especially when that king commanded vast wealth and influence. Leopold's agents worked tirelessly to discredit them, dismissing their reports as exaggerations or lies. Yet the more the king tried to silence them, the louder their message grew. Morel's association expanded, gathering the support of writers, clergy, and politicians. Casement's report was reprinted and discussed in parliaments. The voices of the Congolese people, carried through their testimonies, reached ears across oceans. The impact was profound. What had once been hidden in the shadows became a matter of international debate. Newspapers published shocking details, reformers organized rallies, and ordinary citizens began to see the Congo not as a distant colony but as a moral question. Could the world stand by while an entire land was treated as a private estate, its people reduced to laborers under fear? Morel and Casement's efforts ensured that the answer was no. Their legacy is not only in the reforms that eventually followed, but in the example they set. They showed that individuals, even those without armies or titles, could challenge power with persistence and truth. They proved that the pen and the report, when guided by conscience, could pierce through the walls of propaganda and denial. The story of Edmund Morel and Roger Casement is, at its heart, a story of courage. They did not create change alone, but they sparked the fire that forced the world to look at what it had long ignored. Their determination reminds us that truth, once revealed, cannot easily be buried again. And it reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings and empires, but also by those who dare to speak when silence would be easier. In lifting the veil on the Congo Free State, Morel and Casement gave the world a choice, to ignore suffering or to confront it. Their voices, carried across time, remind us of the power of witness and the responsibility of conscience. Through their efforts, the silence was broken, and the truth was finally heard. By the first years of the 20th century, the illusion that King Leopold II had built around his Congo Free State was beginning to unravel. For years, he had carefully crafted an image of himself as a humanitarian monarch, a man devoted to uplifting Africa through trade, religion, and civilization. But the reports of Edmund Morel, Roger Casement, missionaries, and countless Congolese voices had pierced through that mask. The truth of forced labor, suffering, and ruthless exploitation had crossed oceans, making its way into the newspapers of London, Paris, and New York. What had once been whispered in remote villages was now shouted in the chambers of European parliaments. The world could no longer look away. As the outrage grew, it began to form into something Leopold had not anticipated, a movement of global pressure. Writers, activists, and religious leaders joined hands in a rare coalition, united not by political gain but by moral conviction. The Congo Reform Association, founded by Morel, became one of the first international human rights campaigns. Its members held public meetings, distributed pamphlets, and spread photographs that laid bare the reality of life in the Congo. Every image, every testimony chipped away at Leopold's carefully constructed narrative. Newspapers ran headlines that questioned the morality of Belgium's monarch. Debates erupted in parliaments across Europe, where politicians demanded answers. Even in the United States, President Theodore Roosevelt's administration voiced concern over the reports, adding yet another voice to the growing chorus. Leopold, once celebrated as a visionary, now faced the humiliation of being condemned as a man whose personal rule had led to suffering on a vast scale. The king tried to defend himself. He commissioned inquiries meant to clear his name, but the evidence was overwhelming. He funded propaganda campaigns, sending agents to spread stories of progress and philanthropy, but they rang hollow in the face of mounting testimony. The tide of public opinion was turning, and even his allies began to distance themselves. A ruler who had once been admired was now seen as a liability. In Belgium itself, pressure mounted as well. Citizens who had once taken pride in the idea of their small nation holding influence abroad began to question what price was being paid for it. Politicians argued openly in parliament that the king's private rule of the Congo was unsustainable, not only morally but politically. Belgium risked isolation if it did not act. The final blow came with the undeniable weight of international condemnation. One by one, governments signaled that they would no longer turn a blind eye. Britain, in particular, pushed strongly for change, its own parliament influenced by Casement's damning report. The United States followed, lending credibility to the reform movement's claims. The combined voices of activists, governments, and ordinary citizens created a force too strong for Leopold to resist. In 1908, under immense global and domestic pressure, King Leopold was forced to relinquish his personal control over the Congo Free State. The territory did not become free, however. Instead, it was annexed by the Belgian state and renamed the Belgian Congo. This marked the end of Leopold's private empire, a realm he had ruled as though it were his own possession. His vast wealth, drawn from rubber, ivory, and human suffering, would remain, but his direct power was gone. For many, this moment seemed like a triumph, a victory of conscience over greed, of truth over secrecy. Campaigners celebrated the fall of Leopold's personal rule, believing they had struck a blow for justice. And indeed, in one sense, they had. Never before had an international movement forced a monarch to surrender control of such a vast territory. It was proof that voices raised together could make even the most powerful bend. Yet beneath the celebration lay a sobering truth. While the annexation ended Leopold's direct involvement, it did not end the system of exploitation. The Belgian government inherited the Congo not as a land to liberate, but as a colony to administer. The rubber quotas, the harsh demands, and the extraction of wealth did not simply vanish. Instead, they were reorganized, formalized under state rule. The faces of the overseers changed, but the daily struggles of the Congolese remained. For the people of the Congo, the change in 1908 was not a clear liberation. The forests still demanded rubber, the mines still demanded labor, and the profits still flowed outward to Europe. Villages continued to feel the weight of forced work, and lives were still shaped by a colonial system that valued resources over humanity. The annexation was not an end to suffering, but rather the beginning of a new chapter under a different flag. History remembers 1908 as both a milestone and a reminder. It was the year that public outrage and international activism proved their power, forcing one of Europe's most ambitious monarchs to step aside. It was a victory for truth, for those who had risked everything to expose what was hidden. But it was also a reminder that systems of exploitation are not so easily dismantled. Removing one man did not remove the machinery he had built. Leopold died the following year, in 1909, leaving behind immense personal wealth and a legacy that continues to haunt history. His funeral was marked not by universal mourning, but by crowds who jeered as his coffin passed, a sign that his name had become synonymous not with glory, but with cruelty. The story of the Congo did not end with Leopold's death. Instead, it continued under Belgian rule, and the people of the region would endure decades more of colonial control before their voices could finally rise to demand independence. The annexation of 1908 may have shifted the form of power, but it did not erase the deeper truth, that an entire land had been shaped by the ambitions of one man and the complicity of nations willing to look the other way. And yet, the events of that year also showed something else, that voices raised in protest, across borders and languages, can change the course of history. The fall of Leopold's private empire stands as a testament to the power of collective outrage, proof that even in the darkest of times, truth can still find a way to be heard. In the decades that followed Belgium's annexation of the Congo in 1908, the hopes of liberation seemed distant. The dream of true freedom, freedom from exploitation, from control, from a system that viewed the Congo as a reservoir of wealth rather than a home for its people, remained alive in whispers, in prayers, and in the quiet determination of countless individuals. The chains of colonialism were heavy, but the spirit of resistance could not be extinguished. It lived on through the voices of those who dared to speak, and it grew stronger with each passing generation. Among the first to ignite that flame was a man named Simon Kimbangu. Born in 1887 in a small village in the Lower Congo, Kimbangu was not a politician, nor did he command an army. Instead, he was a preacher, a man of faith who believed in dignity, equality, and spiritual renewal for his people. In 1921, he began to preach a message that struck deep into the hearts of the Congolese. His words called for moral strength, unity, and an end to the idea that they were destined only to serve others. Kimbangu's sermons spread quickly, carried from village to village, gathering followers who longed for hope. To many Congolese, he symbolized more than just a preacher, he represented a challenge to the colonial order. His teachings questioned the very foundations of European rule, not through weapons but through faith and conviction. This alarmed the Belgian authorities, who feared that his growing influence could spark rebellion. The response was swift and harsh. Kimbangu was arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to life in prison. He would spend the rest of his days confined, yet his voice never truly fell silent. His followers, known as Kimbanguists, carried on his message, spreading a spiritual resistance that inspired generations. His legacy was proof that even in the face of oppression, belief in freedom could endure. As the years passed, the winds of change began to sweep across Africa. By the mid-20th century, the world was shifting. Colonized nations everywhere were beginning to demand independence. The scars of 2 world wars had weakened European powers, and the call for self-determination could no longer be ignored. In the Congo, the seeds planted by Kimbangu and others began to grow into a powerful movement for liberation. It was during this era that a young man named Patrice Lumumba rose to prominence. Born in 1925, Lumumba came of age under Belgian rule. He was intelligent, eloquent, and deeply aware of the injustices that shaped the daily lives of his people. Working first as a clerk, then as a postal worker, he experienced firsthand the rigid hierarchy of colonial society, where opportunities for Congolese were deliberately restricted. But rather than accept these limits, Lumumba sought to challenge them. Lumumba became a voice for the new generation. His speeches were fiery, filled with conviction and vision. He spoke not only of political independence but of dignity, unity, and the right of the Congolese to govern themselves. Unlike the carefully measured words of colonial administrators, Lumumba's language burned with passion. He refused to accept the idea that his people were not ready to lead their own future. In 1958, Lumumba helped found the Mouvement National Congolese, MNC, a political party dedicated to independence. It was not easy. The party faced internal divisions, external opposition, and the constant interference of Belgian authorities who feared losing control. But Lumumba pressed forward, believing that the strength of his people lay in their unity. His vision was not of a Congo divided by ethnicity or region, but of a nation strong and united, standing proudly on its own. As the independence movement grew, the pressure on Belgium became impossible to ignore. Protests, strikes, and demonstrations erupted across the country, making clear that the Congolese would no longer remain silent. By 1960, the tide had turned. Belgium, facing mounting unrest and international pressure, agreed to grant independence. On June 30, 1960, the Congo finally stood as a free nation. It was a day of celebration, a day when the dreams carried by generations, from the faith of Simon Kimbangu to the vision of Patrice Lumumba, came alive. The Belgian flag was lowered, and the Congolese flag was raised, marking the beginning of a new chapter in history. At the independence ceremony, Lumumba, now the first Prime Minister of the Congo, delivered a speech that shook the world. While the Belgian King Leopold II's successor praised the so-called civilizing mission of colonialism, Lumumba spoke directly to the truth. He reminded his people of the years of suffering, of the struggles they had endured, and of the dignity they had reclaimed through independence. His words, unflinching and powerful, resonated not only across the Congo but throughout Africa and beyond. Independence did not solve every problem. The Congo would face immense challenges in the years to come: political turmoil, outside interference, and struggles to define its own path. But the moment of 1960 was monumental. It was the culmination of decades of resistance, from the quiet prayers of Kimbangu to the fiery determination of Lumumba. Their stories remind us that freedom is never handed down willingly, it is fought for, nurtured, and carried forward by those who refuse to give in. Kimbangu's faith and Lumumba's fire were different in form, yet both burned with the same essence, the unyielding belief that the Congolese people deserve to live with dignity, to govern themselves, and to shape their own destiny. The journey from colonization to independence was long and painful, but it was also filled with resilience and courage. The legacies of Simon Kimbangu and Patrice Lumumba live on not only in the history of the Congo but in the spirit of all people who continue to fight against oppression. Their voices echo across time, reminding us that no matter how strong the chains of injustice may seem, the will for freedom can never truly be silenced. History often forces us to hold two truths at once, and in the case of King Leopold II, those truths could not be more contradictory. On one side, in Belgium, he is remembered as a monarch who pushed modernization forward, transforming cities with grand boulevards, monuments, and public works that still stand today. His name appears on streets, statues, and buildings, as if he were solely a builder, a patron of progress, and a leader of vision. To many Belgians of his era, Leopold embodied the ideals of a modern king, ambitious, determined, and tireless in his pursuit of making his small European nation a respected power on the world stage. But history is never so simple. For behind that glittering facade lies the darker truth. The empire he carved out in the Congo was not one of progress but of devastation. His so-called achievements in Belgium were funded by the suffering of millions, and the wealth that filled European coffers came at an unbearable cost across the African continent. While the grand arches and museums of Brussels told a story of prosperity, the forests and rivers of Congo whispered another story, one of pain, silence, and unimaginable loss. Leopold's dual legacy is one of the most striking contradictions in modern history. He was celebrated as a nation builder at home, but in Congo, his rule was remembered as a time of coercion, fear, and exploitation. Families were torn apart, communities shattered, and generations marked by the wounds of forced labor and violence. The very same man hailed as a visionary in Europe was, for countless Congolese, the symbol of their darkest hours. When the truth began to surface, through the tireless efforts of missionaries, journalists, and activists, it shocked the world. The evidence was undeniable: millions had suffered and died under a system driven not by philanthropy but by greed. The sheer scale of the devastation led many to describe it as one of the greatest human tragedies of its time. Though debates over terminology continue, the word genocide has often been used to capture the enormity of what occurred, a recognition that Leopold's actions sought not only to exploit but to erase, to strip away lives and cultures in pursuit of profit. Even after Leopold's death in 1909, the shadow of his reign lingered. Belgium's annexation of Congo in 1908 may have ended his personal rule, but colonial control remained, continuing cycles of exploitation and inequality. For the Congolese, liberation would not truly come until decades later, when the struggle for independence finally bore fruit in 1960. Yet even with independence, the scars of Leopold's Congo remained etched into the nation's identity, shaping its politics, its struggles, and its ongoing journey toward healing. Today, the memory of Leopold II is a subject of debate. Statues of him still stand in Belgium, though some have been defaced, removed, or reinterpreted as citizens grapple with how to confront this past. For many, he remains a symbol of a painful history that must never be forgotten. For others, he is still the king who built their nation's grandeur. The truth, however, cannot be confined to one narrative or the other, it is both. He was a modernizer of Belgium and the architect of suffering in Congo. Both legacies exist, inseparably tied to his name. This duality raises a deeper question: how do we remember figures who shaped history through both progress and destruction? Can the achievements of a ruler ever outweigh the harm inflicted in their pursuit? Or must we confront the uncomfortable reality that glory for some was built on the devastation of others? These are not easy questions, but they are essential ones. For the people of Congo, remembering Leopold is not about monuments or marble statues, it is about acknowledging the truth of what was endured. It is about honoring those who were silenced, whose stories were nearly erased. It is about ensuring that history does not repeat itself, that future generations know the cost of unchecked ambition and the dangers of disguising greed as progress. And so, when we look back at Leopold II, we must resist the temptation to simplify him into only a villain or only a builder. He was both, and that is precisely why his story is so important. It forces us to confront the complexity of history, to see how greatness and cruelty can exist within the same figure, and to recognize that the monuments of one land may be built on the suffering of another. As we close this chapter of the story, let us carry forward the lessons it holds. The Congo's past under Leopold is a reminder that truth matters, that justice demands memory, and that the voices of the oppressed must never again be silenced. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who value history, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the past. Together, we can shine a light on the chapters of history that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for joining us tonight. Wishing you all peace, reflection, and a restful sleep. Good night.